Hello and welcome to a conversation with Mekita Rivas. She's here in honor of First Generation Celebration Week, and for this event, co-sponsored with First Gen and the College of Journalism. Mekita Rivas is currently a contributing editor at Cosmopolitan and Bustle. Her writing has been published in the New York Times, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, InStyle, Glamour, Refinery 29, among others. She's currently based in Washington, D.C., and regularly covers culture, style, and politics. In 2012, she graduated from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with a double major in journalism and English. The co-JMC is extremely excited to have Mekita speak with us.
One thing that I kind of always struggled with was sort of like navigating this dual identity of being multicultural and having a multicultural background, but at the same time being American when my parents were not. And so they too, struggled with like, how do I even raise an American child, a young American woman? And so a lot of that was sort of like my own education that I had to sort of navigate for myself. And I think coming to UNL and even just like entering young adulthood at that age, I was 17 as an incoming freshman, a lot of it was like, where are my people? Like that was kind of like my main objective, like really trying to find community and people who kind of understood what I was going through. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of the things that I was able to do, especially in my first few years in undergrad, I had a scholarship through Oasis, a program on campus that is for a lot of like first-gen multicultural students, and I was able to connect with a lot of really great students, but also like counselors and mentors and people who just really helped me get a sense of like what you're supposed to do in college, because that wasn't an example that I got from my parents. So it was really important to like lean strongly into that community, I think, initially.
Awesome.
You kind of got into this a little bit, but what unique challenges from a perspective of a first-gen student did you face here at the university?
Yeah, like I said, a lot of it was just not having that example that had kind of been set forth by my family. So, if you come from, I'll use Greek life as an example because I was in a sorority, and legacies are a really big thing. And so I didn't even know what that was. Like, I didn't know that you could like be a legacy like that. I didn't know how to like wrap my head around that. So it was a lot of like just like very steep learning curves of like, okay, this is how you navigate even like financial aid and filling out the FAFSA. A lot of like leaning, like I said, onto those on-campus resources because I wasn't necessarily able to go to my family for that direction. And of course, like my parents are amazing and they were always like there to be good sounding boards, and I can complain about things and stuff, but there was always sort of like a limit to how much they could understand. So that was, I think, one of the main challenges of being first gen, especially a first gen student, because not only are you embarking on your collegiate education, but it's also very much this like personal education and this like identity education that you have to take on.
Awesome. So kind of going off of that and with your unique perspectives, how have you leveraged your unique perspectives as a woman of color and a daughter of immigrants to help you succeed during your college experience?
A lot of it was just like really focusing on what made me unique, and my cultural identity is a big part of what makes me unique, and being a woman of color is what makes me unique. And I think when I was younger, especially growing up in Lincoln and it being a majority, it was something that I sometimes felt insecure about, and like always sort of like sticking out or sometimes being the only person of color in a room. And so for a really long time, it was, like I said, it was a source of insecurity for me. And I think as I got my education on campus and really grew into myself as a person, but then also as a storyteller and as like a young journalist, I kind of realized like, oh, these things that I was insecure about are actually like my strengths, and they're actually like my superhero powers, you know, and they're what set me apart from everybody else. And I think as I stepped into that power a little bit, it helped me become a more confident storyteller and journalist and all those things.
You touched on this a little bit. What advice would you give to first-generation students who may feel nervous about navigating through the university experience?
Yeah, everybody is nervous and everybody is figuring things out, and nobody has it all figured out. So I think, you know, that the empowerment comes from knowing that, like I said, what sets you apart, being first gen, being a student of color, or, you know, whatever that differentiator may be, instead of being insecure about it or being shy about it, or wanting to hide it, or, you know, any of these things. Like, the more that you can actually embrace that, I think the more empowered you just sort of naturally become, because you're spending less time trying to hide something that's inherently who you are. So I think that's a really important part of it too, and just knowing that you belong here, and that your voice is needed and valued. You know, I think the word diversity gets thrown around a lot, and it can very much be sort of this like buzzword that sometimes gets diluted a bit. It might not really mean anything. But really, it's like, well, diversity, if you have multiple voices at the table from all sorts of backgrounds, and it's not just cultural or ethnic or racial or anything like that, but geography-wise, you know, people from different parts of the world, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, when you have more of that at the table, your outcomes and your results are they're going to be stronger, no matter what. Like, and diversity is not just, oh, let's have diversity for the sake of having diversity. It's also because it's just better. It's just better for whatever your end objective or end, you know, goal is. I think with anybody who goes through adversity in life, it's like you kind of have two choices. You know, your two choices are to be bogged down by the adversity and to feel like, okay, well, I'm just gonna be resigned to the fact that I'm gonna be facing all this adversity forever, and my life's gonna be really hard, and, you know, and you kind of end up getting in your own way a little bit. Or your other choice is to just be like, okay, so this is a fact of life, but kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, it's like, how can you really manipulate that to be fuel for what you're trying to do and what your end goals are? And so, you know, as far as like overcoming adversity in my own life, you know, there have been so many times in my life and in my career where I felt really uncertain about my path, and I wasn't sure that I even wanted to be in media or that I could work in media. And it wasn't until I had sort of my own like personal come to Jesus moment where I'm like, okay, like maybe things haven't worked out how I thought, and, you know, I faced all this adversity, I faced all these challenges, but what am I going to do about it? And I was able to kind of get into this headspace where I'm like, okay, you know, I'm gonna give this thing a shot. I'm gonna, you know, start, and I know we'll get into this with the career questions, but, you know, I can like cold pitch a publication even though I don't know what I'm doing, and just like figure it out. And so I think, like I said, I've overcome adversity in that I've been able to manipulate it just so that I can actually use it as fuel to do what I want to do. My journey was really bumpy. It was really bumpy. It was really not like non-linear and super not traditional. I mean, when I was a student, I came up in like a very strange time in media, because this was back when like my major was news editorial, which like doesn't really like mean anything now. And the idea of working in digital media was just like not a thing. And it was still very segmented. It was like, okay, you're going to be in print, you're going to be in broadcast, or you're going to do advertising and like work in an agency. Like those were the paths laid for you. And full-time job out of college was in local TV news. And I worked for the morning news show in Tucson, Arizona, and the ABC affiliate. I worked the morning shift, 4 a.m. to 1 p.m., Monday through Friday, and it was terrible. Like, I do not recommend doing that. And I was a web producer, so I had ended up not doing anything like in the print world, because again, this was a really like evolving time in media, and like print was dying. Like that was sort of, and it was like, okay, so now let's like pivot to digital media, even though like nobody really knew what that was. You know, at the time, outlets were just, digital was like an afterthought. It was like, okay, we're gonna just like throw like the stories that are in the magazine online. Like nobody was creating original content for digital. So it was really this like weird like infancy sort of period, and it was kind of a new education almost. Like I had graduated and I had my degree, but I was still like figuring things out. And I ended up quitting that job after 9 months because I hated the schedule, and also it was just like local TV news. It just wasn't for me, you know. And I think like that's like a big thing too that I want to emphasize, is that, you know, your first job out of college like probably won't be your forever job, and like that's okay. Like it's okay to not like it, or to feel like, oh well, maybe I failed at this. So I quit that job. I sort of had this like existential crisis and decided to well, at the time actually I was waitressing, and I did that for a couple months, and didn't really know I didn't know what was next. You know, I had done everything right up to that point. You know, again, going back to being a first gen, when you come from a family of immigrants, like it's like you're going to school, you're going to get your degree, like there are these like things you need to check off your list. And I had done all of that, and then it was sort of like, okay, well, what now? You know? And so I was sort of just floating for a couple months, and then I actually got a job here at the university doing communications. And so I moved back from Arizona, and I was here for about 2 years. And then my now husband got a job in DC, so I moved out there, and then I shifted to nonprofits. So I had kind of unintentionally made this transition away from media into like in-house comms, and being like an in-house editor and writer, and that's what I was doing my first like year and a half in DC. And then about 2016, fall 2016, so about over 5 years ago, when I talked about my come to Jesus moment earlier, I decided to start freelancing, even though I had literally no idea what I was doing, like at all. I had actually seen a fellow J School alum have some luck with freelancing, and he was like getting bylines in a bunch of different places, and he's a very talented writer, Carson Vaughn. And I was like, I think I can do that. Like, I think I can do what he's doing, but I don't know how. I'll just sort of, you know, like see. And so at that time, I just started cold pitching. I started, you know, going to different like news outlets, and Bustle, which is like a huge full circle moment for me, just to even, you know, be a contributing editor there now, was the first outlet that published anything I had written. And I think it was literally like admissions at bustle.com. Like the slush pile, like that they're probably, like you're like, I don't know if this is going to like a bot, I don't know if somebody's gonna read this. So I sent something to them, and I remember hearing back from the features editor, and I was like freaking out. I was like, oh my God, this is like a real editor, like they wanna publish my work, like what? And I think I got like $50, and I thought it was just like the most exciting thing in the world. And and it just sort of was like a domino effect, because I did some more work for Bustle, and then was able to get some bylines in some other publications, connect with other editors, and then like here I am sort of like 5 years later, and I have this whole writing career. But you know, like I skipped a lot of like rejection. Like there was that's the thing. Like there's a lot of rejection involved. You have to have super thick skin and like not take anything personally, which is tough, because I think, you know, even though this is my work, the stories I write come from a personal place, you know. When I think about the stories that I want to write, I'm thinking about why, you know, why I want to tell this story and why it's important to me. So therefore, it's personal, and so it's hard, you know, when you're pitching a story and then it gets rejected, or you know, you don't hear back from the editor or something like that. It's hard not to take it personal, but you have to, just because that's the nature of the industry. So yeah, it's kind of like the Cliff Notes version of, again, skipping a lot of like the rejection. So it was a personal essay that's how I started out my career, was writing a lot of personal essays. And that one was about a trip I had taken earlier that year in 2016 to Mexico, actually. So kind of, you know, bringing it kind of in with, you know, first generation, cultural heritage. I spent a lot of time in Mexico as a child, but then, you know, my father is from the border, Nuevo Laredo, where in like the early 2000s, there started to be more like drug cartel violence at the border. So we just kind of stopped going. And so I had this like relationship with Mexico for like probably the first 10, 12 years of my life. And then it was sort of just gone. And so I went back to Mexico for the first time in 2016, and I wrote about my experience and just sort of all of the very like conflicting emotions I experienced, because on the one hand, it was like so great to go back, and you know, like this is like a part of my heritage and this is who I am. But at the same time, you know, being first generation and having to sort of straddle those two worlds, like it's tough, because then also like I don't speak Spanish fluently, so there's that like, you know, that disconnect between myself and my culture, and just feeling like I don't really belong. And I think that's kind of like the essence of the first generation struggle, is like feeling like, you know, I'm not Mexican enough, but I'm not American enough, you know, and like, where do I really belong? And so that was what the piece was about.
That's great.
I once interviewed an exec at IBM who is Filipina like myself, so that was just like a cool thing. But she is on the Watson team, and so she's super high up at IBM, like crazy busy. And I had asked her, you know, about work-life balance and like, you know, how do you achieve that? And she was just like, you know, I don't really believe in work-life balance. And she said, I believe in work-life integration. And that kind of like changed, like that was like a big like mind blow emoji moment for me, because up until that point, and that was probably like 2017, so I was about like a year-ish into freelancing. So at this time, I was like still working a full-time day job and freelancing. And so I had interviewed her, and at that point in my life, I was sort of like chasing that mythical work-life balance. I was like, okay, how can I like juggle all of this? Because when I think about the word balance, I visualize a scale, you know, and I think, okay, like there's going to be this magical moment where both sides are in equilibrium, and I'm finally going to achieve like nirvana or whatever, you know? And like, it's just like, but the reality is that actually you never achieve that. And I think when she talked about work-life integration, and the way she was sort of describing it is it's just like, you have to kind of look at your whole day holistically and figure out, you know, okay, like, for example, there are some mornings where I'm up at 7 a.m. and I'm writing and I'm knocking out, you know, assignments or things like that, and then I'll take like the afternoon off. Sometimes it might be the inverse, you know, where I need to sleep in and I like can't look at my emails until like noon or something. I think it's just like, how can you kind of look at your whole day and pick it apart and figure out when you need to do things? And also too, a big part for me was like, when you're juggling a lot of balls, you have to know which balls are glass and which balls are plastic. And I think about that literally every single day because my to-do list is never ending. I always have like 10 deadlines. And it's like, okay, like what can I drop on the ground? And it'll bounce and it'll be fine and I'll pick it back up tomorrow. But if I let this other ball drop, it's gonna shatter and I'm gonna be really screwed, you know? So it's just, and it's an ongoing process. You know, I haven't like perfected it by any means, but I do think that there's something to be said for like looking at your life, working at work life as more of like an integration thing that you can kind of like, that's flexible and shapeable day to day, as opposed to sort of chasing like this like perfect sort of like balance that like may or may not really exist.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I've never heard that before, so that's amazing.
Yeah.
Great.
I mean, I don't take credit for it. Like I said, it's this like brilliant exec at IBM, so it wasn't me.
The next question was actually asking about how your background influenced your career, which I think you already answered. So I'm going to reword that question a little bit. Do you think because of your background, being first gen and a child of immigrants, that you tend to overachieve, do more things that you need to just because you got to be that person that has to overcome?
Yeah, I'm so glad you reworded it that way because yes, the short answer is yes. And that's something that I'm like still like learn, to be honest with you, because I think when you are first gen, like just like you said, there's always sort of this like undercurrent of like achieve, like do more, and like there's always new mountains to climb, and it's exhausting, you know, and it's really unsustainable too, you know, and I think that that's a lesson that I'm like continually learning, and I'm like I often find myself in the situation where I just have too much on my plate, and I'm like, okay, like am I saying yes to things just because, to your point, I feel like I constantly need to be doing more and I need to be achieving more and I need to keep upping the ante? Or is this something that's actually going to serve me and like me and my career and what I'm trying to do? So I don't have it all figured out because like I said, I'm still trying to like kind of unlearn that, but 100% it's something that I've dealt with and am dealing with.
Awesome. I am going to again reword another question because it ties very well into that. But so when you find those things that you're like, I really want to do this, this is going to push me in the direction I want for my career. How do you sell yourself as the woman for the job? Like, this is what I should be doing and you should hire me to do this.
Yeah, I think it's hard to sell yourself when you don't have anything to show for yourself, for starters. So I think I'm in a really privileged position because I have, years worth of portfolio that I can kind of show to, let's say, an editor about, when I'm pitching a story, and I can be like, hey, here's everything I've done, and like, I think I'm the person to tell this story, or I'm the person to take on this job or assignment. And I'm a really huge believer in your work speaking for yourself, because anybody can talk a big game. So for me, especially in those first few years of freelancing, I really wasn't trying to sell myself really hard. It was just kind of like, I know I just need some experience, I just need some bylines, it wasn't a money grab. Like, I wasn't not trying to make money, and if you're getting into freelancing to make money, you're in the wrong business. So I sort of knew, like, okay, if I want to be the person that people can go to and count on to write a story or complete an assignment or whatever, I need to have like a whole like portfolio to like prove it. So my point being is that I think when you're first starting out, you really just have to put your head down and do the work, and like don't sell yourself too hard, because that's like, if you don't have anything to show for it, like it doesn't matter, you know, because people are going to be like, oh, okay, like, well, what have you done? Like, you know, but it does take having that, you know, that initial break, which I got at Bustle from, you know, cold pitching, to actually get your foot in the door so that you can keep, you know, building. So whatever it is that you're trying to do, like, you just have to like keep putting yourself out there to potentially get that first opportunity that you can then build upon, that then makes you so much more marketable down the road, and it doesn't have to be such a hard sell.
Thank you.
I'm going to reword this question a little bit too. Is there any, you kind of touched on this topic, but is there any pitfalls or areas that you would caution students about making once they enter the career field?
Yeah, I think the thing that comes to mind is, don't think that you have to have it all figured out right away. And I think that, because I did that, you know, like I said, I graduated first gen, you know, this is what I was supposed to do, was graduate and get a college degree and then like go out into the world. And I kind of thought, well, I'll have it all figured out by the time I'm like 22. And it doesn't work that way. And if anything, like that period, your 20s are really a second adolescence. Like, you think that like you leave your adolescence in your teens, but in reality, like your 20s are actually like just another period of like growth and relearning things and failing and trying things that don't work out, and, you know, not great relationships and breakup and all these things. And I didn't realize that, you know, at that point in my life. Like, I kind of thought, okay, like I'm an adult now, like, so I should like know exactly what my career path is going to look like. And I just would caution against putting that pressure on yourself, because you're just like, you're making it so much harder on yourself if you do that. And if you think that you have to have it all figured out by the time that you graduate, I think it's actually very limiting, you know, because I thought I would be like, you know, working in traditional media, like basically like the career I built for myself, I did not know was possible when I graduated college. So it's sort of like, if you think that your life and your career is going to look a certain way, there's nothing wrong with that. It's great to have direction, but at the same time, you should be open to the possibility that, you know, there's going to be detours, and you might end up stumbling upon a different career path that is actually so much better than what you originally had planned for yourself. So being open, I think, is like the number one thing.
Okay, awesome.
So I guess going on from being open and things of that nature, what advice would you give to students in their first couple years post-grad?
Like I said, don't be married to one linear career path. And I mean, this is true for everybody, but especially women of color. Negotiate every single salary, every single contract. Everything is negotiable. So I wish I had known that, you know, early on in my career. I think when you're just starting out, like, it's really easy to just like say yes to everything just because you're just like grateful for the opportunity. And in some cases it's necessary, you know, in some cases you just need the work experience, or you just need to like build your portfolio. But I think it's important to remember that you have more leverage than you realize. I think especially even more so in this current climate, you know, with the Great Resignation, and like, I feel like workers in general have the upper hand more now than they probably have ever had. So leverage that and take advantage of that. And don't be afraid to like fail. Which I mean, it's important to fail. And I am like the perfect example of somebody who is like terrified of like failing at anything ever. Again, going back to being first generation, because it's just like, oh, well, if like I fail, then that means that I like am a bad person somehow, or I'm not good enough, or like all these things. But when I quit my first job out of college, at that news station, that was a failure to me. I thought I was such a failure because this was what I was supposed to do, and I hated it, and I didn't think that like I could have a future in media. But now I'm doing, all these really cool, great things that like, if I had stayed at that job, who's to say that I would have gotten to where I am today? So I think there's so much value in failing. And even though it might not feel like it in the moment, it really is, it's like the greatest triumphs and joys in my life have usually come from a period of like lamenting like some failure. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just kind of moving into more of the lighthearted questions here with the lifestyle questions.
Okay.
We have been stalking you.
Oh my God.
We all think you are a rock star.
Oh my God.
You're like the coolest person we've seen.
Thank you so much.
Wow. What we'd like to know is how have you gone about creating your own personal brand and showcasing this badass person?
Well, first of all, thank you. That's so nice. I find the idea of having a personal brand really cringe. Like, it's not something I intentionally do, right? And I think that like, it's not just like your personal brand, but like the most successful like brands, the things that you all are like working on, like they don't try too hard, like there's just like a natural element that like draws you to them, or that like just feels like really authentic or cool, or there's just some like je ne sais quoi about it, and it's just like, oh wow, like I just want to learn more about this person or whatever this product is or whatever. So in terms of like how have I done this, like again, it's nothing I've like intentionally tried to do. I think my presence on social media it's just like an extension of like what's in my head, and like what my interests are. So, fashion, culture, politics, lifestyle, like all these things. It's like, okay, these are all things I just like find interesting and that I would talk to my friends about and my husband about, and so I'm just gonna like put this out on my social, and if like people think it's cool, then great, it's kind of like, I guess I kind of just approach it as like, well, this is just sort of like a peek inside my head, like at any given moment. And like every platform is different. Instagram is definitely a more curated, highlight reel version of my life. And Twitter is more just like stream of conscious, and I sort of just like say whatever, which sometimes gets me into trouble. But it's like, it's not trying too hard, and being very true to yourself. And I know that sounds super cliche, but it's like, I'm not going to be on Instagram talking about like sports. You know what I mean? Like I just, like go Huskers, like whatever. But I mean, they need to start being better for sure. But yeah, like I'm not going to do anything that feels unnatural, because I think the minute that you do that, that's when like the appeal of your brand goes away, right? And so I think it's just like, what are you actually interested in? What really feels authentic, even though I feel like that's becoming kind of another buzzword, but it's like really like leveraging how you feel about the world and putting it out there. And if like that attracts people, then like that's great, but at the same time, it shouldn't be like, I've never been driven by like, I need to have 100,000 followers or whatever, because then I think that's not a good approach.
That is a cool answer, though. Just be who you are and don't care about it so much. That is really cool.
So diving more into Twitter a little bit,
Yes.
how do you deal with like Twitter trolls or if someone doesn't like your tweet in a professional way?
See, it's the in a professional way that I kind of got stuck on because well, the mute button is like my best friend. Like I live and die by the mute button. I'm very much about like just like protecting my peace in real life, but also on social. And I think when you are a public figure, it's like there's like a certain degree of, you know, privacy and anonymity that you sacrifice. So it's like, how can I like maintain those boundaries to the best of my ability while still being available? I mean, short of like, you know, I can make all my accounts private and all of these things. But, you know, it's like, but I want people to find me. I want them to find my work, you know? And so, mute button for sure. And honestly, like I don't really engage with trolls, like, or not even like, I wouldn't even say like, because not everybody who disagrees with me or maybe doesn't like something that I write is like a troll necessarily, but it's like, you know, sometimes like somebody will just say, oh, like, well, maybe you should have considered this like in your story or whatever. And it's like, well, sometimes I might respond and sometimes I might not, you know, it's like, you have to just sort of like know what your bandwidth is at any given moment. And I think, you know, more often than not, especially after this year, I don't have a lot of bandwidth. I don't have a lot of bandwidth to like give to random people on the internet. And so a lot of times it's just like ignoring and, you know, I mean, it'll still get to you though, of course. You know, I'm human, like, definitely, but I try not to pay too much attention to it.
Awesome.
I'm going to let Ilana ask this next question because she's been dying for this.
Yes. So I read one of your articles and I wanted to ask you, what did you take away from your ill-advised tweet debacle?
Oh my God. Don't tweet past 10 p.m. That's like the number one thing because my brain shuts off at that point of the day. But, you know, a lot of things, like the importance of having a sense of humor, for starters, and like being like the butt of like lots and lots and lots of jokes. But, you know, it's like I learned that there are various degrees of virality because that particular tweet had gone from, you know, viral on Twitter to like mainstream viral, like on like network news. And that was like when things got crazy, like crazy. And and that was really kind of a moment where it was like, oh, okay, like I'm the butt of joke, like I can make fun of myself, like whatever, it's not that serious, to like there's random people in my DMs calling me racial slurs. So it's sort of like, oh, like this can be like kind of fun and playful and like I can like laugh it off to a degree, because then it's just like, then all of a sudden it's like it gets really personal and really uncomfortable and really hard, and you're just like, whoa, like I didn't know that like random people on the internet like felt so strongly about this, you know, ill-advised tweet that I made. And I think like that was a big part of why I even wrote the glamour piece too, was to sort of have my say and share my story, kind of like how that all happened, where it was like, okay, like you have a viral tweet, you say something dumb, and it's kind of the end of it. Like there's usually like a 24-hour, you know, cycle on these things. But that was the case where the 24 hours had passed, and then it got picked up by network news, and then it was sort of this like prolonged thing that like really blew up and really brought out, you know, the trolls, whether it was, you know, racial slurs in my DMs. You know, there was like a guy who found like my wedding registry link and was like stalking me there, and it was just really weird and really intense and really uncomfortable. So I think the whole debacle really just like underscored the importance of knowing the reach of your platform, because I think that that was something too that I even had underestimated myself, because I don't have like the hugest reach. I mean, like, you know, like 4,000 some followers on Twitter. At that time I had even fewer, and you never really think like this is going to be a viral tweet, right? Like you just like, again, it's stream of consciousness for me. Like Twitter is very much like my unfiltered sort of just like word vomit in a lot of cases. And I just learned like, okay, like I need to be way more cognizant, you know, of this platform and how I use it and when I use it and all these things.
Touch on that a little bit more. I guess what's your view about mental health and social media?
Yeah, I mean, especially I think in our industry, I mean, if you're in news and in media in particular, like this last year and a half has been really, really, really hard, really, really hard. And there's been so many days where I'm just like, I can't watch TV anymore. Like I have to turn off the news. I have to have a day where I'm not checking Twitter and I'm not checking Instagram. And like going back to what I had said earlier about protecting my peace, it's like, well, I do that through having those boundaries. And it's like, I think when you do work in media, it's really easy to be consumed by the industry and to just like constantly be checking Twitter and scrolling and like staying on top of headlines and all that stuff. But like, I, you know, would always say like, well, I'm doing this because it's my job, right? Like I have to be in the know. I have to know what's going on. But like, up until I think honestly this last year and going through the pandemic and the fight for racial justice and like the like attempted coup that happened like less than a mile from where I live in DC, like there was so much stuff. And you know, it just got to a point where it's like, even though I'm in this industry, like I don't have to be like consumed by it all the time. And when it comes to protecting your mental health in particular, I think it's like very important to have those boundaries. And then also like if you're in the industry, like to communicate with the people you're working with that like, hey, I need a mental health day. Like you know, and I do that all the time with my editor at Bustle. You know, it's like, today's really heavy, like I need a mental health day. Or like with other editors I work with, I have no shame in asking for a deadline extension. And that's a relatively like new thing for me, because I was firmly like the kind of person who's like, I'm always gonna meet the deadline and I can't miss a deadline because you live and die by your deadlines. And that's something that's very much instilled just I think even like in the J school, you know what I mean? Like deadlines are so important, but at the same time, no deadline is more important than your mental health or your well-being, like period. And it's not worth killing yourself or agonizing or, you know, doing any of these things. Like being communicative with the people you're working with that, you know, you might be struggling and you need a little bit more time is so important. And if they're not responsive or receptive, don't work with them. You know, and I understand that that does come from a place of privilege, but, you know, I think generally like that's something that we should all be aspiring toward, you know, to work in environments and to work with people who understand that that's important, you know, to, that the work is always going to be there.
Thank you. So our last question before we turn it to the audience to ask questions is, in a recent tweet you said, did you know that you can hire and commission Latinx writers year-round, not just for 4 weeks in September and October? So what can organizations do to create more opportunities for minority professionals in our field?
It definitely starts with the leadership, I think, because I think we're having, you know, we're going through a period where there is recognition that representation across industries, not just media, but has been lacking. And so now there's all these attempts to like course correct and, you know, get more Black and brown people, you know, in newsrooms or on writing staffs or like whatever the case may be, which is great, which is so great and it's so needed. But a lot of times, you know, that diversity is just happening at the entry and mid-levels. And then you get to the top and it's pretty white and it's pretty male-dominated too in a lot of cases. So I firmly believe that in order for radical change to happen, the executive teams and the C-suites and the people who are funding, different grants and opportunities for young entrepreneurs or things like that, because if you have just a group of white men at the top, it's like, well, what are the odds that they're going to understand really what the unique struggles of people of color are, and how are they going to make business decisions that actually promote diversity and encourage diversity that's going to be sustainable? Because I think, after 2020, like I said, there's been this noticeable shift, but it's we don't want it to just be a trend, this is supposed to be a matter of longevity and something that's going to that needs to happen over decades, because really, we're finally course correcting injustices and inequalities that have existed for decades, if not centuries. I mean, depending on how far back you want to go. So just number one, I think, is just leadership. I think companies have to do some serious self-audits and humble themselves a little bit. And I work for a company that, I've worked for companies, I should say, that are very white male dominated at the top. And I think until that changes, unfortunately, we're just going to kind of keep being in this same place. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, audience questions now, and Redaniel has a mic so that they can hear us on the live stream.
Hi. So I guess the question I have two questions. As a first gen and immigrants, how do you spoke about, taking on too much, overfilling your plate, like you're at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Constantly.
Yeah.
How did you choose your career path, being a child of immigrants? Did you have any pressures from your parents to be a doctor, be a lawyer? How did you choose to do what you love?
Yeah, great question and great analogy regarding the Thanksgiving plate, because that's exactly how it feels. I don't know that I always knew I wanted to be a journalist or work in media. I just know that I always wanted to be a storyteller. I've been journaling since I was 5, and I have an older brother, but he's 12 years older than me, and so I kind of grew up as an only child. But I had a really, like most kids, I had a really active imagination, and so the way for me to sort of channel that was through journaling. And so I've always just journaled, and that was always writing was always kind of my outlet. And I started watching the morning show, actually the Today Show, with my mom when I was a kid. And this was the Katie Couric era, and she was just one of my heroes. And I kind of put two and two together, oh, I can do this professionally. I can tell stories, and this can be a job. And so that was kind of when the light bulb went off, and I was okay, maybe I'm gonna pursue a career as a journalist. But as far as the pressure piece of your question, no, and I know that that's not always the case, but I am very fortunate to have two parents who have always been super supportive of what I wanted to do, especially pursuing a journalism career, and they were always my biggest supporters back when I was I was on the newspaper staff in high school, and then writing for the DN and coming to the J School here at UNL. Admittedly, I think there were points, like most parents, where they were skeptical, about this being a lucrative career path, and they're are you going to be able to pay your bills? Is this a real, we don't want you to be struggling too much. So that was always a piece that was there. But they have always been super great and super supportive. And, I think I'm still figuring out what kind of journalist I want to be. Like, it's kind of an ongoing evolution for me. But that's kind of how I got to this point.
Thank you for your answer. Second question I had, growing up in Nebraska, predominantly white state, as a first-gen child of immigrants, woman of color, lacking the presentation that there was in the media at the time that you were growing up, how do you navigate, and if at all, do you face imposter syndrome as a woman of color in your industry? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I deal with imposter syndrome literally every day. And, I'll be in situations where I'm just like, do I really belong here? And when am I going to be found out? When is somebody going to come up behind me and be like, you don't belong here. What are you doing here? And I think that that it never entirely goes away. And I think, something I had mentioned earlier about, just feeling empowered and how to sort of tap into that empowerment is, for me, there had to be that shift between, this is something I might be a little insecure about, or that I've never felt like, oh, I want to hide my cultural identity, but because I did grow up in Nebraska, which is a predominantly white place, and because I was so used to just sticking out, it got to a point where it was like, I just want to not stick out, Can I just show up and do my work and not feel like, my skin color is like a marker, of who I just am. And sometimes it's just like, but I think that I've been able to get to a place where I feel really, really proud to be multicultural, to be a woman of color from Nebraska specifically, because I think that is actually another really great advantage that people from this part of the country have, because on the coasts, it can be kind of insular, if you're on the East Coast, there's a lot of people who are from the East Coast, and same thing with the West Coast, and it's being from a place like Nebraska. I mean, people are like, are you from Alaska? Arkansas? It's just Nebraska. It's the middle of the country. Look at a map. But it actually is something that can be, I was talking about what's your differentiator? That in and of itself is a huge differentiator. And when you can bring that to the table, bring this totally radically, radical to people on the coast, but they're so used to being in their New York bubble or their DC bubble or the LA bubble, and then you're coming from a place like Nebraska. It's regardless of your cultural heritage, it's you bring something very unique to the table that nobody else has. And so this is a very long way of answering your question, but I think that once I realized that, it really helped with the imposter syndrome. And it was okay, I have something that nobody else does, and this makes me a valuable commodity.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It goes off of what you actually just said, but I was wondering, coming from a place like Nebraska, how do you transition into a career in a bigger city like these? How do you kind of make that transition?
Well, no two paths are the same, that's for sure. I think that the number one thing is prepare to have everything in your world turned upside down. Especially if you're from, because I was born and raised in Lincoln, this was really the extent of my worldview. I had traveled across the country quite a bit as a kid, spent some time in Mexico with my family, and I had studied abroad. So I had some experiences outside of Nebraska, but they were pretty limited. And so I think the number one thing is to be cognizant of the change of pace, because that's a huge thing that I still feel even to this day, just traveling back and forth between DC and Nebraska when I come back home to visit family or whatever. DC in particular is a very hyper ambitious place. It's people come there from all over the world to change the world. And it's very inspiring, but it's also like a lot, you know, and it's radically different from a place like Nebraska where, you know, I often joke that when I land, I usually fly into Omaha, so I'll like land at Eppley and then I step out into the terminal. It's like everything is kind of in slow motion, like everything comes down a couple notches. So number one is I think just preparing for that like pace shift. And New York is like a whole other level of intensity, right? And so if you can like take a trip out to where you're trying to move, like a couple trips ideally, just to get a lay of the land and become familiar with where you're going to go, that would be my number one recommendation, so you don't feel like total culture shock. The other thing too is like, you know, from a logistical standpoint, you know, it's ideal to have some money saved up. A couple months rent is probably ideal. But at the same time, I would also caution against like letting those logistics get in your way. Because I do think that especially people coming from a place like Nebraska and like moving to the big city, like it can be this kind of like very romanticized thing. And you're like, well, I need this and this and this to be like lined up before I make this big move. And then before you know it, you're like 5 years later and you haven't done it yet, you know? And so I think like figure out what that like sweet spot is for you in terms of like your comfort level. For me, I was sort of like, I knew that I wanted to live somewhere outside of Nebraska, but when my husband got the job in DC, like DC actually was not on my radar. Like I wasn't trying to move out there, but now I actually love it, so it's like worked out really well. But I kind of like got thrown into it a bit, and so I didn't really have any time to prepare. But I always had the mindset of like, I want to be around this type of energy. You know, this is like the level that I'm kind of trying to compete at. So it all worked out for me. But I do think that if you can save up some money, but don't feel like you have to save up all the money. Like I think it's like you will figure it out, and having that trust in yourself will make such a difference. And like I said earlier, like don't be afraid to fail, because you will, you know what I mean? And I think if you can just be comfortable with that, you'll be in such a like better headspace, instead of thinking like, okay, the minute I land here, I have to have this great internship or this great job and meet all these people. It's like, it'll all come into place, so long as you're just like focused on what you're trying to do in this new place.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any future career goals or personal goals right now? Or do you have I want to be here in 10 years type of thing?
Yes, I do. There's, I mean, like you said, first generation, like we're always kind of like, okay, what more can we do? What other mountains can we climb? I'd love to pivot into book publishing. I don't know what that'll look like. There's some ideas, there's some things kind of in the works. I don't really know when that will happen either, because there's a part of me that's like, honestly, there was a part of me that was like, when the pandemic happened, I'm like, I'm gonna use this time to write a book, and that did not happen. Like I was on the couch like watching New Girl for the 10th time. So I think it's like, I know that I want to do this, but I don't know when it'll happen. And I think that's sort of where I'm at in my career. It's like, okay, I want to write a book, or books maybe potentially. You know, there are tons of other publications and outlets I would love to write for. Because I grew up in the age of print, I still hold print very near and dear to my heart. So I've been fortunate to have a couple pieces in print, but I would love to do much, much more print work. And I don't know. Those are the kind of the main ones at the forefront, but you know, never say never. I would love to maybe be in a writer's room for TV or film. So there's a lot of potential career paths. So we'll see. It's always changing, like I said. Like there's always new routes to follow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, so you've been incredibly inspirational to listen to today.
Oh, thank you.
Who or like what do you look up to find your own inspiration?
Oh my gosh, that's a really good question. I'm really inspired by like women of color entrepreneurs who like launch their own business, and I'm gonna give a little shout out to my girl Ashley in the front. She has her own jewelry business, and I just think like it doesn't have to be like major, like it doesn't have to be like the like the biggest thing in the world. It's like if you want to end up in Nordstrom, like I love that for you. But I just really admire like women of color who have a goal or have a dream and like just go after it unapologetically, especially because I do think for so long it's like we've just been kind of like relegated to the sidelines or just sort of like considered expendable, I think even in some cases, or like our point of view doesn't matter or what we bring to the table doesn't matter. So anytime that I can see women of color in particular prospering, and especially I think launching your own business, because that's hard. I mean, it's hard to find the time, raise the capital, market yourself, build a brand, like doing that all on your own is really, really tough. But another woman who comes to mind is my editor at Bustle. Her name is Jessica Andrews. I'm gonna have to send her this live stream, but she's so incredible. She's my mentor, and I started working with her at Teen Vogue, and then she moved to Refinery 29, and I followed her to Refinery, and now I'm with her at Bustle. And if I were to identify a single person, a single woman who has completely changed the course of my life, it's her. And our relationship is really a testament to the power, and she's a Black woman, a really incredible Black woman, and I think that our relationship is just a testament to like just the strength, the inherent strength and power that comes when women of color work together and look out for one another. And I just wouldn't be where I am without her, basically. And I've been able to do so many incredible things because of her, and to have somebody who is championing you for so long has just been so incredible, and I can only hope to return the favor, pay it forward. But yeah.
Love it. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a question. First of all, I would like to recommend, I don't know if you know Amanda Seals.
Yes.
She has a podcast called Small Doses, and she does a lot of entrepreneurship on the side with her comedian and acting gigs.
Very cool. I love her.
I love her.
Love
too.
her on Insecure. She's so funny.
She's so funny. But the other question I was going to ask is, how do you or have you had to cope with the grief that comes when things don't happen in your life as you planned? Because I know that especially with our generation, a lot of our parents or grandparents will ask us what do you plan to do when you graduate? And they expect us to have an exact plan for our lives. And so when those things don't come to fruition and you end up going a different route, even if you like that different route, how have you been able to cope or grieve with the routes that you didn't follow?
Yeah, I'll use the example that I had brought up earlier about quitting my first full-time job out of college when I worked at the news station. I literally took at least 6 or 7 months. I remember I quit in March, and I pretty much took through August I was just a cocktail waitress, literally in Arizona, just hanging out by the pool, sleeping in until noon, barely making enough money to pay my student loans and car loan. And my now husband was the reason I was not out in the street, basically. And so I think it's so important to actually physically give yourself the space to do that grieving process. And for me, that looked like just being a cocktail waitress, working part-time and hanging out by the pool and watching TV and being aimless for the first time in my life. Because up until that point, like I had said earlier, I was always on this very laid out framework of like, okay, like go to school, get your degree, get your first job, and like now you're an adult. And I had never had a moment in my life where I was just totally lost and like, and had no idea what was coming next. And it was super uncomfortable, but I needed to give myself the actual space and time. In that case, it was like, 5-6 months to really just like feel that. Because I think if you don't do that, you're going to end up feeling it at some point down the road. Like it's going to resurface eventually. So, in some cases, it might be that like you are taking a part-time job that has nothing to do with what you're trying to do. Like you just need a job to pay the bills. But it's going to give, it's like, well, what are you getting in return? It's like, well, you're getting the space and time to what you thought was going to happen didn't happen how you thought it would, but then B, to just like be present too. Because I think coming out of college in particular, you're like, there's still like that rat race mentality of like, okay, like, so what am I doing next? And I think at some point, whether it happens right after college or some point in your 20s or 30s or even later in life, it's so important to have a period of like taking the pressure off, like as much as possible, because the pressure will literally always be there. And I look back, even though I was so lost at that point in my life, I look back on it really fondly now. Like there are times where I'm like, I should do that again. Like I should just quit everything and, just like cocktail waitress for a couple months and just like clear my head. Because, when you've been chasing a certain dream for so long, I think you can kind of get tunnel vision and like forget that like there's like a total like other world out here beyond like trying to figure out your career or your next steps. Like that's all very important, but like, make room to like really feel the failures or to really feel the things that didn't work out how you thought they would. Because then I think you can come out of that experience with a lot of really good clarity, about what you want to do next and what your next step should be. And that's exactly what happened for me.
Probably very relevant. Where'd you get your outfit? Like obsessed.
Yeah, so this is a brand called Choosy. And my shoes are from Zara. But yeah, this brand, it's called Choosy. It's from about 2 years ago, so I don't know if you'll find this exact thing online anymore. And that suit also is from Choosy. They're Choosy. They have the cutest stuff. So I would highly recommend.
Awesome.
All right. Can you tell us where we could find you online, social media?
Yes, on Twitter I'm at Mekita Rivas, and on Instagram I'm at Rivas Raves. So it's my last name and then Raves, R-A-V-E-S.
All right.
Awesome.
We want to thank Mekita for joining us. She's wonderful. And we also got a gift for you.
Oh, yeah.
Some co-JMC swag.
Yeah.
Yes.
Love some swag. Thank
Yes.
you. Oh my
All
God.
right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We do appreciate it. And once again, Mekita, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.